the classic model of events. Now we're looking, if you need a reference besides the W3C school site, there is the textbook on Blackboard that's available for free through the library ebooks. Instructions are online in our Blackboard course. Is the Visual Quick Start Guide to JavaScript. Events are in Chapter 8. The first few pages are pretty good. It gets kind of cryptic toward the end. But it's a good reference if you need it, and it's free. So JavaScript is an event-driven language. So what's an event? It's basically loading a web page or clicking an element or editing a text in a form. Basically, it's things a user does. And the implication there is you, as a programmer, do not have control. The user is in control, and you're responding to events. You're not creating events so much as responding to them. Here's some examples of some classic events. You probably recognize mouse overs and mouse outs and clicks and things like that. JavaScript uses a few weird terms in that if an object has focus, or if it gains focus, it means the user's made it active. If somebody clicks or tabs into a form field, it's active. It's in focus. And when they leave it, or they click outside of it, it blurs. So you'd have on blur is the event that happens when somebody tabs or clicks out of a form field. There are lots of them. You can find lists everywhere, but the more common ones that you use all the time are the ones you think about. Mouse over, click, on focus, on blur, load, unload, kind of things. If you go to the W3 School site, here's one of their list of mouse events and keyboard events. And like I said, it gets very detailed. Besides just clicking, you can test for key down, and key press, and key up. Say if somebody's playing a game and you want to test and make sure that they're holding a key down before you respond in a certain way. That's how you would do it. And form events, we have focus and blur and change. Lots of different events for different circumstances. It would be very, very boring to go through them all. I suggest you read through them, kind of become familiar with them so you know where to look when you need them. So where do you put an event? The traditional classic way that we don't do anymore is in line with your HTML. You'll see this occasionally, you may even need it occasionally, but it's generally considered kind of old school, where you have an anchor tag here and you just say onClick equals, you have the event, and then some JavaScript. Notice the usage of the double quotes that contain it and the single quotes inside so that the parser doesn't get confused where the JavaScript begins and ends. Just be careful there with your punctuation. But since HTML is case insensitive, it's less worried about case than JavaScript is. When we start kicking these out into an external script, JavaScript is going to care. HTML, not so much, but depending on which doc type definition you use, it might not validate if you don't use lowercase. So the principle is JavaScript should be unobtrusive. In other words, you're going to try and separate your JavaScript code from your HTML page, which is why that old method of attaching events is frowned upon. Just like CSS is in a separate style sheet, it's best to put JavaScript in a separate style sheet or a separate script sheet so that it's easier to debug, it's easier to share code, it's just much simpler all the way around. Another thing you want to do is embrace the limitations of the browser. The browsers are meant to do something that C# and, say, Visual Basic aren't, and vice versa. Embrace the browser. Use appropriate techniques for a device, and we'll cover a lot of those as we go along. Event handlers and event listeners are attached to objects. You're saying, well, what's the difference? Hold on, it'll make more sense in a little bit. We have here an element, and we're adding an event, and we're saying equals function. We're attaching an event to an object and saying, if this happens to this object, do this function. For example, if you have a login form that has a submit button, you have an onSubmit event, you've attached it to the login form, and you want the validate from function, or method in this case, to run when the submit event fires. The same with window. When when it loads, window.onload, you're going to say run this initialization method. That's all this is. You're basically assigning a function to an event. The function on the right, the event on the left. And it's an assignment statement, which means that there's a little bit of a weirdness that might trip you up. All of these functions, you're saying, well, where's the parentheses? When you're assigning a function to an event, you don't use parentheses because the parentheses mean it's a verb. It means act on it. It means run the function. But you don't want to run the function. You just want to assign it. So leave off the parentheses when you assign a function to an event. Otherwise, it'll run. And you don't want it to run. You're just trying to put what's in the function and assign it to the event. Only use parentheses when you're calling a function or wanting to run the function. It's a fine point, but it'll trip you up. Sort of like these two things that are pretty common. Forgetting that you don't put quotes around it or using parentheses. Think of it as a normal assignment statement. You're taking a variable and you're putting in the value or copy of the function into the event. Now, one thing we always want to do is make sure a page is loaded before you refer to objects on the page, because if you have JavaScript that says, hey, where's this paragraph, and it doesn't exist yet, you tend to run into a few problems. So what you do is you test and make sure the window is completely loaded, then run your code. And what you do is you say the load event for the window. Once that happens, once that fires, then run this function. And you're assigning the init function to the onload event for the object of window. The function on the right, the event on the left. And then you'd, of course, make your function down below whatever code you'd want to happen. And that's it for simple ones. Stay tuned for real-world examples.